He wrote no books. He left behind no scrolls, no carved monuments, no formal school to bear his name. And yet, more than 2,000 years later, the entire foundation of Western philosophy still rests upon his silence, his questions, and his refusal to pretend he had all the answers. His classroom was the street. His blackboard was the mind. His only tool was the question. And with that question, he shook the very ground of certainty. What do we really know? He was mocked by playwrights, admired by students, feared by politicians. To some, he was a wise fool. To others, a dangerous thinker. To history, he became a symbol of resistance, of integrity, of the unbreakable human spirit in search of truth. In the golden age of Athens, where art, power, and reason danced in the shadows of empire, there stood one man, barefoot, bearded, unshakable, challenging everyone, from slave to senator, to look within. His legacy would not come from eloquent speeches or grand declarations. It would come from a quiet revolution, the revolution of the mind. This is the story of a man who questioned everything, and in doing so, taught us to begin thinking for ourselves. This is the story of Socrates, the man who changed the world, by asking why. Long before Socrates would be called the father of Western philosophy, he was simply a boy in a city of brilliance and contradiction. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a place like no other. It was a cradle of democracy, a forge of art, a stage for orators and poets, generals and visionaries. Marble temples stretched toward the sky. Theaters echoed with the voices of Euripides and Sophocles. Statues of gods stood on hills, watching over a society that was, in many ways, the first experiment in collective freedom. And yet, beneath the gold and glory, Athens trembled. It was a city constantly at war, against Sparta, against Persia, against itself. Politics swayed like the Aegean winds. Loyalty was fragile, justice often selective. While the city worshipped wisdom, it also feared it. While it celebrated freedom, it feared those who pushed its limits. It was into this complicated world that Socrates was born around 470 BCE. The exact year is uncertain, but the world he entered was unmistakable. Brilliant, dangerous, and hungry for thought. He was born to Sophroniscus, a stonemason, and Phaenarete, a midwife. His family was not aristocratic. There were no noble titles, but in that household, rooted in manual labor and birth, Socrates absorbed two life-defining lessons. That truth must be carved with patience, and that the soul, like a newborn, must be delivered with care. As a child, Socrates was observant, not of stars or animals, but of people. He listened, he asked questions. He was drawn not to tales of war, but to conversations about character. He saw how leaders spoke with beauty, but acted with contradiction. How citizens praised democracy, yet yielded to impulse. He began to wonder, could a society be truly wise if its people were not? He was not born into books, but he found his way to thought. He studied with philosophers who explored the heavens and the elements. But even as they chased the secrets of the stars, Socrates turned his gaze inward. What use is knowing how the world moves, he asked, if we do not know how to live within it? He grew up during a golden age, and yet he saw its cracks. As he watched the rise of rhetoric, of ambition disguised as virtue, he began to sense that Athens, for all its achievements, lacked something deeper, something quieter, something truer. As Socrates reached adulthood, his questions deepened. He served as a soldier, fought bravely, and earned admiration for his courage. But unlike other men, he did not return from war thirsting for wealth or influence. He returned still asking, what is justice? What is virtue? And how do we know if we are truly good? These were not academic questions. To Socrates, they were the essence of life, and he would spend the rest of his years not answering them, but inviting others to ask them with him. Athens, for all its splendor, was a city in turmoil, politically, morally, spiritually. But out of that turmoil emerged a figure unlike any other. A man who believed that the unexamined life was not worth living. He would have no wealth, no fame, no power. But he would have something far more enduring, the courage to ask why. Socrates did not grow into a philosopher the way others might grow into a profession. He did not wake up one day and declare himself wise. In fact, he would spend his entire life denying that he was wise at all. What set him apart was not that he claimed to know, but that he admitted what others would not, that he did not know. In his youth, he explored the same paths as many thinkers of his time. He studied the natural sciences, listened to the cosmologists, and considered the theories of atoms, motion, and the origin of the universe. He learned from the Milesians, and later from Anaxagoras, who believed that mind was the organizing force of all things. But while others looked upward to the stars and the nature of the cosmos, Socrates looked inward. He asked not what the world was made of, but what we are made of. He shifted the center of philosophy from the external to the internal, from the sky to the soul. He walked the streets of Athens not as a scholar in robes, but as a common man. Barefoot, unshaven, dressed simply. He turned down wealth, rejected fame, and refused political office. He lived modestly, even poorly by some standards. Yet his presence commanded attention, not because of how he looked, but because of how he made others think. Socrates believed that living a good life required more than tradition, more than obedience to law, more than piety to the gods. It required awareness, reflection, and above all, reason. He believed that true morality was not inherited. It had to be examined, questioned, and chosen freely by the soul. He began to challenge the men of Athens, craftsmen, generals, poets, even lawmakers. He would ask them what they claimed to know. What is justice? What is piety? What is courage? They would give answers, confident at first. But as he gently probed and asked more questions, contradictions emerged. Assumptions crumbled. Their confidence turned to confusion. This was not cruelty, it was clarity. Socrates believed that confusion was the beginning of wisdom. Wonder, he said, is the feeling of a philosopher, and philosophy begins in wonder. But he also believed that knowledge alone was not enough. To live rightly, one must cultivate the soul. For him, the soul was the seat of moral character. And just as the body must be trained and fed, the soul must be exercised through dialogue, reflection, and the pursuit of virtue. It was this belief that made Socrates so dangerous in the eyes of some. He did not just question ideas. He questioned power, hypocrisy, and tradition. He refused to accept that something was right simply because it was written, or because the city said so, or because the gods demanded it. And in doing so, he became a rebel, not in arms, but in intellect. He had no school, but students gathered. Young men from influential families came to listen, to argue, to think alongside him. Among them was Plato, who would later carry his teachings into the future. Also among them were men whose political actions would, unintentionally, bring danger upon him. But for now, Socrates was rising, not as a leader, not as a priest, but as something Athens had never truly seen before, a philosopher who believed that the highest calling of a human being was to know themselves. He would become the city's conscience, its mirror, and eventually, its scapegoat. But that fate had not yet come. For now, he walked the agora freely, challenging Athenians not to think like him, but to think at all. Socrates did not write books. He did not publish treatises or deliver lectures from a grand podium. Instead, he walked among the people, in markets, workshops, gymnasiums, and street corners, and he asked questions. That was his method. Simple, deceptive, revolutionary. He would approach a statesman, a soldier, a poet, or a craftsman and ask them what seemed like a harmless question. What is justice? What is virtue? What is courage? When they answered, he listened, not to praise them, but to examine their reasoning. He would say, "That is interesting, but if justice is what you say, then why does it not apply here?" And with each question, layer by layer, he would peel away their certainty. What began as confidence would often end in contradiction. This was the birth of what we now call the Socratic method, not a style of debate, but a path to truth through dialogue. It was not designed to win arguments. It was designed to awaken thought. Socrates believed that true knowledge begins with the recognition of one's own ignorance. He called himself a midwife of the mind, not giving birth to truth, but helping others bring forth what was already within them. "I know that I know nothing," he said, not in despair, but in defiance of false knowledge. He believed that to live well, one must think clearly, and to think clearly, one must first doubt. He doubted the poets who spoke of virtue yet lived in vanity. He doubted the politicians who preached justice yet chased power. He doubted even the gods, or at least the way men claim to speak for them. But he did not doubt reason. And he did not doubt that the soul, each human soul, was capable of more than it believed. To Socrates, philosophy was not an academic exercise. It was an ethical mission, a way of living, a way of being, a way of seeing the world not as it appears, but as it ought to be. His questions were not weapons, they were mirrors. Held up to the powerful, they revealed hypocrisy. Held up to the ordinary, they revealed potential. And when held up to the self, they revealed a path toward virtue. He taught nothing. He awakened everything. And in doing so, he became more than a philosopher. He became a fire, quiet, slow-burning, and destined to spread. As the years passed, Socrates became a fixture of Athenian life, not as a celebrity, not as a politician, but as a relentless presence. Always walking, always questioning, always listening for contradictions. But what truly drew attention was not just what Socrates said, it was who listened. The young men of Athens, bright, restless, and hungry for meaning, began to gather around him. They followed him through the agora, stood beside him in debates, and soaked in every word. To them, Socrates was not just a philosopher. He was a mirror to society, a man unafraid to challenge the powerful and unafraid to challenge them. Among his followers were names that would echo through history. Plato, the quiet observer who would become his voice to the future. Alcibiades, brilliant and impulsive, a future general and traitor. Critias, sharp-tongued and ambitious, later a tyrant of Athens. It was a dangerous mix, wisdom, youth, and ambition. And in the eyes of the city, it became a threat. The elders of Athens watched with suspicion. Why were these boys from noble families drawn to a man who questioned everything? Why did they begin to challenge tradition? Why did they laugh when he exposed hypocrisy in court or temple? Whispers grew. Some said Socrates corrupted the youth, made them arrogant, disrespectful, rebellious. That he taught them not to honor the gods, not to obey the city, not to follow their fathers. But Socrates did not teach rebellion. He taught reflection. He did not give his students answers. He gave them tools to think, to reason, to live with integrity. Still, in a city exhausted by war, humiliation, and political chaos, such tools were dangerous. Athens had recently suffered a brutal defeat by Sparta. Its democracy had faltered. Tyrants had ruled. Trust was thin, and people were eager to blame someone. Socrates had become too visible, too influential, too unsettling. And his association with controversial figures, men like Alcibiades and Critias, gave his enemies the opening they needed. They painted him not as a teacher, but as a corrupter. Not as a philosopher, but as a hidden hand behind rebellion. He, who had never sought power, was now accused of poisoning the very minds he had tried to free. But Socrates did not run, he did not hide. He continued day after day to walk the streets of Athens, asking his questions, challenging assumptions, and inviting even those who hated him to think.
By the year 399 BCE, Athens was no longer the city it had been. Its golden age was tarnished. Its democracy had faltered. Its armies had been defeated. Its pride had been bruised, not just by Sparta's victory, but by the tyranny that followed. A brief reign of terror by the 30 tyrants, a brutal oligarchy, had left the city anxious, suspicious, wounded. When democracy was finally restored, the people were ready to cleanse themselves, to rebuild not only their city, but their identity. They needed someone to blame, someone who represented the uncertainty, the disruption, the questioning that had shaken their values. That someone was Socrates. He had never held office, never led armies, never written inflammatory speeches or plotted in secret. But he had done something far more subversive. He had made people think, and thinking, in an age of fear and pride, was dangerous. 3 citizens, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, brought formal charges against him. The accusations were simple, but damning, corrupting the youth of Athens, not believing in the gods of the city. In a society that prized loyalty and piety, these were not minor infractions. They were existential threats. To question the gods was to question the soul of the city. To corrupt the youth was to endanger its future. Socrates was summoned to stand trial. It would not be a trial of crimes, but of character. Not of actions, but of influence. And yet, when he appeared before the 501 jurors, ordinary citizens of Athens, Socrates did not apologize. He did not plead. He defended. He said he was not a teacher, for he charged no fees. He said he was not impious, for he spoke often of a divine voice, a daimonion, that guided his conscience. He said he was not corrupting the youth, but instead challenging them to pursue virtue, not wealth, justice, not ambition. He compared himself to a gadfly and Athens to a great noble horse, powerful but sluggish without someone to stir it. "I am that gadfly," he said, "and I will not stop." He reminded the court that the unexamined life was not worth living, that to fear death was foolish, for no man truly knew what came after, that silence, obedience, and flattery were far more dangerous than honest doubt. But Athens was not in the mood for philosophy. The jurors were not swayed by logic. They were tired, defensive, eager for simplicity in a complicated world. And so, after arguments were made and votes were cast, the verdict came. Guilty. By a narrow margin, the court condemned Socrates, not to exile, not to silence, but to death. Even then, the law allowed Socrates to propose an alternative punishment. He smiled and suggested that, for his service to the city, he should be rewarded with free meals for life. The court did not laugh. He then proposed a small fine, but it was too late. The sentence was sealed. Socrates would die, not by sword, not by mob, but by poison, a cup of hemlock administered by the city he had tried to awaken.
The courtroom was simple. There were no columns of marble, no echoes of glory, just 501 ordinary citizens seated as jurors, and one extraordinary man standing to face them, not as a criminal, but as a question. Socrates stood in the center, barefoot, unflinching, surrounded by murmurs, judgment, fear, and a city on edge. This was not a trial about crime. It was a trial about conscience. The accusations against him were familiar by now. He did not believe in the city's gods. He had corrupted the minds of its youth. He had planted doubt where the city demanded obedience. And yet, when he opened his mouth to speak, Socrates did not defend himself like a man begging for mercy. He spoke like a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. He began with humility. He admitted that he was not a skilled orator, not trained in the polished arts of persuasion. He would speak, he said, in the same voice he used every day in the agora, plainly, truthfully, and without performance. He then confronted the charges. On the matter of the gods, he did not deny believing in the divine, only that his understanding of the divine did not match the city's rituals. He spoke of his daimonion, an inner voice, a spiritual sign, that had guided his actions his entire life. If anything, he argued, this showed his devotion to something higher, not his denial of the sacred. On the matter of corrupting the youth, he asked, Why would he seek to harm those around him when he himself must live among them? Would a horse trainer harm his horses? Would a citizen weaken the very city he loved? He called on the honesty of his accusers. He turned their logic inside out. And in the process, he exposed not only their arguments, but their motives. Then came the moment that echoed across centuries, the words etched into the soul of philosophy. The unexamined life is not worth living. He did not mean life without wealth. He meant life without reflection, life without honesty, life without the courage to face oneself. He told the court, if they ordered him to stop questioning, he would not obey. If they offered him life in exchange for silence, he would choose death. Because to Socrates, truth was not negotiable, and death was not the worst thing a man could face. Living without purpose was. When the sentence was read, he did not flinch. When his disciples cried, he comforted them. When the poison was prepared, he received it without fear. To the very end, Socrates was himself, a questioner, a challenger, a man of the soul. He told his friends not to mourn. He reminded them that either death was a long sleep or a journey to meet other great minds. Either way, he would continue what he had always done, asking questions. And then he drank, calmly, with grace. As the poison took hold, his last words were simple. Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please, don't forget to pay the debt. A tribute to the god of healing. Even in death, Socrates saw philosophy as a kind of medicine, one that cured the soul.
The cell was quiet. Outside, Athens went about its daily life, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, that something irreversible was about to happen. Socrates sat surrounded by a few close friends and students. Plato, though absent that day, would later immortalize the moment. Others wept. Some pleaded with him to escape. Bribes could be arranged. The guards could be swayed. But Socrates remained still. He refused to flee, not because he believed the court was just, but because he was. To escape would mean breaking the very laws he had spent his life examining. To run would be to contradict himself, to trade principle for preservation. And so he chose to stay, to die, not because he wanted to, but because he would not lie. The cup was brought in, filled with hemlock, a slow, cold poison. No ceremony, no delay, just a quiet instrument of state-sanctioned death. Socrates took it in hand. He asked what he should do. The guard told him, "Drink, then walk until your legs grow heavy, then lie down." He lifted the cup, not as a victim, not as a martyr, but as a man who had lived according to what he believed and would now die in the same way. He drank. Bitterness on the tongue, silence in the room. The poison began its work, first in the feet, then the legs, rising slowly, as death always does. But Socrates remained calm. He continued to speak about the soul, about courage, about truth. He reassured his friends. He smiled. And then, the moment came. His legs grew numb. He lay down. He covered his face. And with his final breath, he whispered, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please, don't forget to pay the debt." It was a strange thing to say, but in those words, there was meaning. Asclepius was the god of healing. A rooster was the customary offering for someone cured of illness. And Socrates? He believed death was a healing, a release of the soul from the distractions of the body. His life had been one long preparation, not for death, but for clarity. And now, with peace in his heart and philosophy in his blood, he departed. No crown, no glory, no monument, only silence, and the quiet, lasting echo of a man who chose to die, rather than stop asking why.
Socrates died without title, without riches, without writings of his own. And yet, his legacy would outlive kings, conquerors, and empires. He was gone, but his words remained. carried not by books but by memory, by the minds of those he had stirred, and one in particular, Plato. Plato, his most devoted student, would dedicate his life to preserving the voice of his teacher. He wrote dialogues, vivid dramatic conversations, in which Socrates was the central figure. Through them, Socrates lived on, always questioning, always listening, always challenging what others took for granted. And through Plato's works, Socrates would become the foundation of Western philosophy. Plato's academy would nurture a young man named Aristotle. Aristotle would go on to shape science, ethics, logic, and politics. And through him, the ripple of Socrates would reach across centuries, continents, civilizations. But the legacy of Socrates is not just intellectual. It is moral. It is personal. It is human. He showed us that wisdom begins with humility, not the certainty of knowledge, but the courage to admit we may be wrong. That virtue is not a rule to follow, but a life to examine. That philosophy is not for the elite, but for everyone. He did not create a school. He created a spirit, a method, a mirror. His method, the Socratic method, is still used in classrooms, in courtrooms, in debates and discussions around the world. It is not a technique of destruction. It is a pathway to understanding. His refusal to submit to fear, to power, to flattery, that became a model for generations of thinkers, rebels, and seekers of truth. From Renaissance humanists to Enlightenment philosophers, from civil rights leaders to modern educators, the echo of Socrates can still be heard. Ask more, assume less, think deeply, live truthfully. Socrates once said, "I am not an Athenian or a Greek, but a citizen of the world." And indeed, his ideas belong not to a nation, but to humanity. He was not a god, not a prophet, not even a teacher in the formal sense. He was something rarer. He was a man who refused to lie, even to himself. A man who refused to pretend. A man who chose to die rather than live unexamined. And in doing so, he became immortal, not in body, but in thought. He wrote no books. He founded no school. He held no office. And yet, he changed the course of human thought forever. Socrates did not ask us to worship him. He did not demand belief. He simply asked a question, and then another, and another. He stood in the face of comfort and convention and asked, "Is this truly just? Is this truly wise? Is this truly good?" And when the world offered silence, he kept asking. He taught that courage was not found in battle alone, but in the quiet, persistent choice to live with integrity. That power meant nothing without virtue. That knowledge meant nothing without self-awareness. Socrates believed that the greatest journey is inward, that to know the stars without knowing the soul is to remain lost, that to live without examining your values, your actions, your beliefs, is not to live at all. He faced death not with defiance, but with dignity, not with sorrow, but with serenity, because he had nothing to hide and everything to offer. His legacy is not carved in stone, but etched into the way we speak, question, learn, and lead. Into every classroom where ideas are challenged, into every courtroom where truth is pursued, into every soul brave enough to say, "I do not know, but I am willing to ask." Socrates lived in a small corner of the ancient world, but he belongs to no era. He is timeless. He is the whisper that questions the shout, the pause between certainty and truth, the conscience of civilization. He was not just the first philosopher. He was, and still is, the man who refused to stop thinking.